There we go. I guess we scared a few people away last week. But I'm in the tail end of a cold, so hopefully my voice will hold up through all this. We're going to plow through a fair amount of content today, so we'll buckle up and get going. I want to start off kind of a highlight of why I think there are supports for the Judeo-Christian belief system, at least kind of my top 7. And I think, first of all, there is this entire historic arc of the Bible from God's creation to redemption. The nation of Israel is one of the only nations that ever survived one captivity, let alone 2, plus a pretty long hiatus as a nation, coming back into existence after World War II. I think there are numerous prophecies that are fulfilled over time, especially about Jesus, that were made hundreds of years before his birth. We'll look at some of those more detailed next week as we think about the authenticity of Scripture. I think the resurrection of Christ is the core proof of Jesus' deity. Paul said it. I think it's absolutely true. Watching modern critics dance around textual criticism, I'm kind of surprised more people don't focus in and say, okay, but of all the messages that didn't get lost in translation was the disciples' sincere belief in the resurrection of Christ. You know, that was no mystery in the oral tradition or in the written manuscripts. And next week is just a preview. We're going to look at some of those very early papyrus records, because if you think around German textual criticism, post-World War II period, many of them were trying to ascribe Gospels as being much, much later than we ascribe them today. And part of that is just the papyrus records that we've seen uncovered over the last 60-ish years. The core tenets of Christianity work both psychologically and sociologically. We know that, the principles of Christianity, when actually lived out, are good for our internal health and mental health, as we're thinking about that series, as well as our external community. Many would argue in our current culture that as Christianity, or as God has been removed from the public forum and square, from the classrooms, we've seen an increase in the tears of the fabric of our culture and society. I think it's very clear from the historic record that something extraordinary happened in the first 3 centuries of Christianity that allowed it to survive and thrive despite being persecuted really by all authorities, the Roman government, the Jewish religious leadership. It was punishable by up to death even to have Scripture in your possession. So clearly this fact that we have so many manuscripts, we have this history, we see Roman historians and Jewish historians writing around the Christian movement and acknowledging its presence is very significant. Most other cults were stamped out pretty quickly into that kind of intense persecution. It's interesting in today's world to even consider this, but the majority of historic philosophers, scientists, writers, all came to a conclusion there was at least a creator, a theistic premise. Even Darwin acknowledged a creator. And so it's interesting that in our current culture, we've kind of erased several thousand years of thought and history to now come to a conclusion, well, there can't be God. And I think that's interesting in light of the fact that it was not that long ago when the prevailing position was one of at least deism, if not Judeo-Christian beliefs. And finally, I've said this before, and I think it's a very important one in a cultural context of postmodernism. I and many others have experienced personal loving God. I've seen him intervene in my life. I've seen the ways he's worked in other people's lives. I've seen lives changed and transformed positively. That doesn't tend to happen in my experience apart from Christ. And I think that's something that is the secular atheism movement's trying desperately to argue, well, you can think your way to better. That's not what the general human experience is. It's certainly not the choice most people make apart from Christ. I gave you a bunch of different forms of epistemology last week and ways that people think. As a point of clarification, somebody brought this up. In our world of kind of a la carte thinking, people will tend to draw from multiple camps. Just be cognizant of the fact that people don't tend to silo off their thoughts, some even contradictory positions. So I wanted to distill it down to maybe 4 other ways of thinking about truth. One is the correspondence theory, which is whatever is observable, corresponds to the observable reality must be true. If I drop the pen and gravity takes it to the ground, pretty clear. The coherence, that if the claims are true, they follow logically a set of axioms or premise or thoughts. There's going to be a coherence to that strategy, that overall body of thought. And I think this is one of the places that when critics try and pick apart Christianity, they'll focus on one issue. How does the Bible deal with slavery? Or what about the problem of evil? They're not looking at the holistic view. Does it support a consistency in a worldview? Consensus theory. This is probably the prevailing appeal these days. What does the majority or everybody, quote unquote, believe to be true? If we took a popular vote and everybody said, I think I can fly, problem is that's not going to prove out to be true. And finally, the pragmatic theory of truth, what's useful and beneficial. And I think there's a lot in postmodernism that would tie to this. I've heard some critiques even around the idea that faith is like an essential oil. A lot of people claim that they have these beneficial effects. The difference is nobody's ever formed a religion that I'm aware of, at least, around essential oils. Nobody's argued there's something supernatural per se to them. And so I think there's a difference in the truth claim of is something beneficial versus something absolutely true. And be careful as you're discussing with non-believers not to kind of get sucked down this rabbit hole of, well, I have to be able to see its outcome before I can believe it. Because we know by definition of faith, you first have to believe, then you see the benefit. It's not the other way around. I will spend just a couple minutes on some logical fallacies, because I think when we get into some of these concrete arguments, it becomes very clear why we need to think about this. And logical fallacies at its core is something that can be disproven by reasoning alone. There's some observable error in the thought process. And this is where the Latin phrase non sequitur comes from. It does not follow. And so I'll give you some specific examples. This is a very common one in our current culture, ad hominem, which means you're trying to invalidate the position based upon a personal attack. And as an example of that, somebody might say, well, Catherine's a bad choice for mayor because she didn't grow up in this town. It's not, those two don't follow, they're not logically connected. In politics, you'll see someone going after somebody's character or personality or past history or whatever. And I've said for years, if some bum walks up on the street to me and hands me a folded piece of paper and says, here's the secret for cold fusion, it doesn't matter who they are as to whether or not that is in fact the secret to cold fusion. I can't judge it based upon the character of the person delivering the message. A red herring, this is a very common one we also see, this attempt to shift the focus from its core point to some other abstract one. An example might of that be losing a tooth can be scary, but have you heard of the tooth fairy? I'm throwing this total monkey wrench that has nothing to do with about losing a tooth. And we see this frequently in Christianity where they'll attack the church, someone's behavior as a Christian versus is the claim of Christianity true? Yes, we're sinners, we're flawed. Of course you can attack the church based upon individual conduct, but that has nothing to do with the truth claim. A straw man, this also is a very common one. You're going to see this hyperbolic or overinflated version. Instead of dealing with the real truth and the facts and the circumstance, you make this boogeyman out of it almost. An example of that might be, Aaron thinks we need to stop using all plastics right now to save the planet from climate change. You can paint this extreme position that may or may not be representative of what the argument even is. An appeal to authority, where someone argues because there's authority figure, has expertise, and claims something, therefore it must be true, or sometimes it just gets overstated. And we see this a lot in apologetics, where people will appeal to people with degrees, have written books, whatever. They may not even represent that expert's actual position, but they also are not analyzing, is the argument grounded? And we'll look at this next week very particularly, where a guy like Bart Ehrman will say there's 400,000 errors in Scripture. And when you start dissecting those, you very quickly realize that the majority of what he's talking about is a misspelling or a verb tense. It's not anything that would be considered an error that's so meaningful that you couldn't overcome it at just its plain reading. And yet he'll say later in his book, doubting Jesus, well, 95% of the Scripture we have is probably what it said. Okay, if you give me 95% as a critic, that's a pretty significant position to take. Your argument may or may not follow then logically to your conclusion. This is another huge one, the bandwagon fallacy, that it's something is the right action or is the right claim of truth just because it's popular. If we look at clothing trends, they've changed significantly over time. There are clearly things that were popular that probably most of us would look back and go, that may not have been the best possible choice. That might not have stood the test of time. And I think, this is that idea of course, it's fine to wait until the last minute to write your paper. Everybody does it. This is a very insidious element of postmodernism, that we almost feel like somehow we should vote on truth instead of that truth exists independent of our opinion. And I think this is one of the things that's very hard as we start talking about apologetics, particularly around a spiritual realm that maybe you can't touch, taste, and feel firsthand. That truth exists, whether you want to wrestle for it, whether you want to embrace it, whether you want to do the homework that it takes to understand it, doesn't determine whether it's valid. And finally, the circular argument, where you basically are just using the premise to fulfill the logic or the argument. There's no new information. And so, like, for example, peppers are the easiest vegetable to grow because I think peppers are the easiest vegetable to grow. There's nothing there that's concrete, and you'll see this in academic circles frequently, where they will even be their own expert. Well, I believe it to be true, therefore it's true. That's not a good argument. We didn't get a chance to finish up on design, some of the critiques, but I thought it was interesting. Just last week I saw this article, The Origin of Space-Time, Maybe It's Quantum Magic. Believe it or not, that was the headline in a major scientific news publication. So magic is okay, but God is crazy, just so we're clear on the definitions here. In essence, the idea was we can't really solve the time-space problem in Big Bang, therefore we're just going to ascribe it to mystical force that's not God. And I've seen a number of cosmologists say overtly in debates, well, because I will not accept the premise of God, I must accept this other equally crazy statement, whether it's alien seeding, whether it's quantum magic, whether it's whatever. You have now made an intentional choice to move away from what the logical conclusion might be because you don't like the outcome. And we're seeing this more and more in this position of academia, where they're slipping in these ideas just to avoid the logical conclusion that space and time and creation as we understand is so complex that the mathematical models just don't work. As it's interesting, at one hand, as we see the archaeological record growing in support of Christianity and what happened in the first century, as science is progressing, it's going the other way. They're getting more and more problems. Even the general theory of relativity under Einstein now has some problems given the quantum dynamics world. And so they're having to come up with these new terms. And Richard Dawkins, he's a very populist evolutionary biologist. He's written several books that are very anti-Christian. He's very large in the academic circles as someone they point to as a defender of atheism. And I thought this was a great quote by him. He says, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, Some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. That's an awfully rousing life view, isn't it? You really feel the passion for seizing the day and living your purpose. That's his conclusion, and I think it's logical from random chance. There is no purpose. And I think this is what atheists will always struggle with is, please tell me why anything absolutely matters if it is simply random chance and there is no cause, there is no creator, there is no purpose or design. You construct one, I suppose. I feel better when I do X, but that's just a delusion if you look at it from a Richard Dawkins view. And I want to drill in a couple of things. And first, I think it's important to state, God created both the physical universe that science observes and Christianity. Therefore, there can be no conflict between the two. Man's understanding may be flawed and create inconsistencies between the two. I still lean towards a young earth position, but I understand why there are those that adopt an older earth perspective. I don't think Genesis is exclusionary to that view. I also know God can create things to look older. I know that God can instill attributes that are beyond the physical dimensions as we understand. The mere fact that we would argue there are angels and demons, say there are things outside of the material plane, or at least as we understand time, space. And I thought it was interesting, again, an article from 2 weeks ago, they are recognized as this, quote, higher symmetries that are illuminating everything from particle decays to behavior of complex quantum systems. For every major advance in physics for more than a century has been turning around revelations about symmetry. There was a paper published called Generalized Global Symmetries, and this was trying to solve some of the problems of Einstein's theory of relativity in the quantum world. What's fascinating to me is that we see these symmetrical patterns of how particles are interacting with each other. It screams to me, if you have this mirror image or symmetry, is it really happy circumstance and chance? Yes, there are obviously mathematical principles that surround it, but it screams to me for a creator, a designer, that intended these patterns to exist at the submolecular level. And we wouldn't have even had the ability to see these things 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I mean, it wasn't even within our comprehension of science. And yet, as we've become more educated, and we have better devices, if you will, to look beyond the, into the submolecular world, we are realizing, there are these patterns that don't seem to fit the other laws of physics. Another one I have seen a couple biologists hitting on lately, which is really interesting. Our DNA code, and we looked at this back in Genesis 2 and how complex it is, but there actually is redundancy built into that double helix. There's an error correction pattern that exists, that DNA that exists in one cell next to the other that isn't identical, it actually self-corrects. And there are safeguards as that double helix is being formed and those chemical barriers are being initialized. There's almost a proofreading that goes in. And it's saying, okay, am I seeing the sequence I expect to see? If not, let's fix it. It actually has created some massive problems for evolutionists, because if the cellular DNA is fighting, in essence, to make sure I always make the perfect copy one after the other every time cell reproduction occurs, how do I get mutations? How do I get mutations that last? Is a huge problem from a genetics level. And as we've mapped the human genome, we know what causes functions like curly hair or a certain height or whatever. What we don't know is how do you change that and get it to stay changed without clearly artificial intervention, either splicing a new sequence in, going and editing the base proteins, because naturally it doesn't happen. We've gotten some cross-pollination in plants, but that's still taking two different species, forcing them together, trying to get something else out. It's not mutating the original strain. Another big problem is biogenesis, and this is the idea that cells can only be formed or subdivision of pre-existing living cells. And Louis Pasteur was one of the early thinkers in this. It progressed over time. Interestingly, there is a phrase that's been brought up more recently called abiogenesis, which is the idea that chemical sludge, the primordial ooze becomes living cells. This violates all the premises that we accept of biology. I have not heard anybody argue that chemistry evolves, that chemical reactions are a constant. There's always been this argument that somehow biological cells evolve. But how do you get from no life to life is a huge step. Bearing in mind this was much, much after the Big Bang in an evolutionary timeline. And so they have to actually have two very mystical events, one being the Big Bang and forming order out of an explosion. That's a problem. Two being sometime, millennia later, this perfectly formed planet with all the base building blocks now creating life spontaneously, I suppose. That's a big problem. The other one I thought was really interesting, I just learned about recently, is genetic drift. That even when there are some adaptations, a giraffe with a longer neck can reach higher branches, whatever, there seems to be this overwhelming force of selection that actually prevents adaptations gaining a foothold in a population. And I think it goes back to this DNA redundancies, that even where we can say something's demonstrably better, something in biology tends to weed out those adaptations, mutations, whatever term you'd like to use. And so we're seeing that it's not actually the case that these beneficial traits actually carry on through the population. And that's a huge problem for an evolutionist, because they want to say, in essence, every bad mutation gets dropped and every good mutation keeps going, even to the level of adaptation among species. So just those couple, I think, create such problems at a biological level. It's interesting watching how many scientists that are biologists by root or training are coming to faith and are giving public statements that they had embraced evolution until they started looking at these kinds of problems and said, I can't overcome it. It was too problematic for them. So if you saw these images laying about somewhere, how many of you would think there's a painter involved?
Yeah, and not a godly painter.
I mean, isn't that a naturally occurring color palette in cats and toads? Yet, isn't it interesting, we go, no painter, when we see it in actual nature and the amazing paint jobs these diverse species have. I love that one in the middle top. It's actually a spider called a peacock spider. Yeah. And when a large chunk of the animal kingdom is colorblind, what's the necessity of this? Patterns, stripes, camouflage, sure. This is not that. This, to me, screams the creative palette. And obviously I didn't come anywhere near capturing all of the majesty of colors that we see in the animal kingdom. But as just a quick selection across a pretty broad spectrum, it is interesting to me that logical, reasonable people suspend their normal conclusion, because I think a lot got used to kind of the watchmaker argument. Okay, well, it's a watch and it was made because you've seen other watches. But I don't have to have seen other creatures like this to go, something distinct is different here. This isn't even the norm within nature. I want to give you just a couple of thoughts on the Big Bang Theory as well, since that is still a prevailing view, although science is trying to kind of silently put it aside and move to some other quantum dynamic models. But in essence, the premise is the universe is expanding. Think of putting like dots or something on a balloon. As you blow it up, they move farther apart. as one reverses the expansion and extrapolates back in time, you basically get to this denser and denser form till you have some point in a finite past that an event happened. Many refer to it obviously as a Big Bang. The other challenge that has always existed is they have historically had to argue there was nothing before and then something happened. Because time in traditional physics is defined as the relative motion of two objects, including a molecule. So there couldn't have been any matter or energy or motion of any form, at least not in space-time as we understand it, before this singularity. And now you're starting to see some quantum singularities and all kinds of interesting multiverse discussion. But two people who actually argue for this say it's very difficult to devise a system, especially a quantum one, that does nothing forever and then evolves. There's a recognition of this problem of stasis, absolute no motion, to now expanding universe, especially when you have no creator as a prerequisite or assumption. And I would argue the laws of thermodynamics stand in direct opposition to the Big Bang theory. That even an equal and opposite reaction is staggering to consider in physical terms. The idea of entropy, things devolve, and the idea that if there was an explosion, you would expect that constant of expansion would be consistently going. Now, due to modern cosmology, we understand the universe is actually accelerating in its expansion, which is a fairly significant problem. So now I want to turn to some of the arguments for God. I thought I would pull Dostoevsky into this. As a Russian novelist and certainly a guy who thought through this, he says, without God, we lose an objective basis by which to make moral judgments. And I think we have evidence in our current culture of the challenge of relativistic morality. I would observe just sociologically that every human culture that we know has had some form of moral law. Granted, they vary, but there is an underpinning or concept of morality that's pretty universal. And so either these moral ideas are completely subjective and therefore meaningless, or they must be grounded in some unchanging standard. Either murder is categorically wrong or it's not. If it's just I feel like it's right today, well, that means it could change tomorrow. And so the basic historic argument goes something like this in 3 points. Human experience and conscience indicate there is an observable moral order. God is the best or maybe even the only explanation for that moral order, therefore God exists. That's a very classical proof, and I think it's what C.S. Lewis argued. He said if evolutionary naturalism is accepted, human morality cannot be described as absolute and objective because moral statements cannot be right or wrong. And I think this is a very significant problem in a post-truth world. We hear people saying things like, well, that's your truth. My truth is different. Well, okay, that's your morality. My morality is different. Those are consistent conclusions. And I've wondered watching some of these debates why somebody hasn't pushed a little harder in to say, wait a minute, if I have the stronger position, I'm the proverbial warlord in fill-in-the-blank country with guns and tanks or maybe even just trucks, why can't I come seize everything you have? Why is that immoral? Because in an evolutionary world, it gives me an advantage. Obviously, in a Judeo-Christian tradition, we would say there is absolute morality that makes that wrong. It's not about who is stronger. It's not about that I can force an outcome. Is it morally right or wrong? Where we have the ability to make judgments about morality because there is the sense of an absolute. Sure, we could quibble about should the starving person be allowed to steal bread. I mean, there's fringe cases that we could think about, but in terms of broad, overarching, is there absolute morality or is it all subjective? I think most people, if they're honest, recognize there has to be some systematic, objective set of moral tenets and code of conduct, if you will. Old philosophers used to call it the, quote, ought. What I ought to do. Another one that I think is interesting that's a little more recent is an argument from human dignity or intrinsic value, because one of the things that's very dangerous, and you see modern atheists trying to defend morality based on, well, I treat people well because they all add value in some way, culturally or societally. But I can paint cases of people that are no longer capable of adding value. Somebody in a vegetative state for some period of time. And I can create a scenario in which it's improbable they're going to add value. Does that mean they have no value intrinsically anymore? Or does it mean they still have intrinsic human life and value? And I think this one, to me, is capable of being summarized in these 3 bullets, but it goes beyond that. That human beings seem to have some special kind of intrinsic value, different from the rest of the animal kingdom, that we might call dignity. That the only or best explanation that humans even possess that dignity or any intrinsic value other than just survival is that they were created by a supremely good God in his own image. And therefore, there is likely this supremely good God, that if we are created beings in the image of God, that gives us a unique standing. It means that there's reason to believe there's intrinsic value. If I am a happenstance, a random probability, I'm not sure you can argue intrinsic value. You might be able to say, well, I'm contributing today because I do something, whatever that might be. And Immanuel Kant said it well, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the other person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. And in other words, it's not the ends justifies the means, that people have value independently of our assessment of them or their contribution to society. This is a very interesting one because it gets back to Richard Dawkins' concept. Why would you expect any fairness or any objective value if we're all just this cosmic byproduct of random? But if you put in a loving God who created us uniquely and formed us in our mother's womb, each of us intentionally, with characteristics and DNA and experiences, that gives value that transcends whatever monetary equation or trade value or contribution I make to a culture. We touched briefly on the experiential argument before. I won't spend a lot of time, but it's this idea that when someone feels the presence of God or experiences God in a real way, they have this direct and personal experience. And I've talked to a lot of people that aren't hardened atheists, they're more the agnostics, so they don't really want to acknowledge God. And an awful lot of them have acknowledged some form of spiritual experience in their life, something that couldn't be explained in simply, material or physical ways. And I think when we think about that spiritual reality, the spiritual experience, and it transcends any material explanation, we have to start wrestling through it, because according to kind of naturalism or classical materialism, material world only, nothing can exist that transcends that. It has to be all chemistry, all biology, all physics, all math. There can't be anything that is ever an exception. And I've seen several interesting historical reviews of Jesus we'll see in 2 weeks that start from the premise, because miracles transcend that material world, I will not accept any history that includes miracles. Well, that's an interesting thesis to start with, because I would even argue, I think there's a biblical argument that the sorcerers in Pharaoh's court seem to be able to provide some level of non-material, exceptional outcome. Whether you want to call it a miracle or magic or whatever, I think there are forces in the world that are greater than just chemistry. I'm going to be skeptical of them. I'm still going to want to have some level of evidence, but I think people have experienced miraculous things even apart from God. I will go so boldly as even to say that. To start from a premise that miracles can't happen, therefore I reject all of them, seems lunacy to me as a historic argument. And I think it's this insidious thing that tries to take apart the experience, or you can't trust your own lying eyes, proverbially. Whereas I think in theism, we say that God endows people with the ability to perceive, even if it's imperfectly, the spiritual world, to see miracles, to recognize these transcendent qualities. And therefore, I'm not limited to just my five senses even. There may be other ways that I sense God moving. And I think to the extent that you accept that first premise, that there are these things that exist outside the material world, it really drives home this idea of theism, because now, if there's anything transcendent, if there's anything spiritual in the universe, it starts beating up a lot of the most modern views of rejecting God because it just can't exist. And it's very interesting as we see this smorgasbord of religion, and coming out of California and seeing some of my friends there that have made this hodgepodge of mysticism and spiritualism. It's funny where they will accept the premise that there is this non-physical world that exists out there, and yet they'll ascribe godly characteristics to crystals or essential oils or other inanimate objects that don't have any explicit power beyond their physical makeup or structure. And yet if I talk about God and having a relationship with God, they look at me like I'm crazy. And it strikes me as this very significant double standard that for somebody to accept a premise that there is any spiritual universe, then you've opened the door to, well, what is that? And isn't it the most important thing you need to research, understand? And I would say, as a conclusion to my experience, that this following the way of Christianity, if you actually live out what the Bible asks of you, it produces more love, joy, peace in your life than any other possibility. And again, this is a pragmatic argument at one level, but I think it's also a sociological or psychological argument to say the places that Christianity have been lived out generally have less crime, have less suffering, have less disunity than the places where pure humanism is lived out. And if we look at the extremes through World War II under just Stalin, Hitler, and Mao, tens of millions of people were slaughtered by their own governments under the guise of doing what was right in a humanistic view. Whatever critiques anybody wants to level around the imperfectness of the church or of any partnership between politics and church, it has not resulted in that number of slaughter ever. It is not to say it's been perfect all the time, but it also is not consistent with the principles of the New Testament that I think is fairly plainly read. Do unto others as you would have done unto you, the old golden rule, solves an awful lot of societal ills. We are not operating, in case you didn't get the memo, under that tenet in this country any longer. We are operating under a very different premise than that. This is one that is kind of a homebrew I've been playing with, this argument from aesthetics. I've yet to see a compelling argument for why we should be able to appreciate art, music, culture, poetry. What's the evolutionary value of aesthetics? You don't tend to see packs of wild animals pausing and watching the sunset. Yet if you drive along High Drive at sunset, you'll see a whole bunch of cars parked along there watching the sunset. The fact that we as humans have perception of beauty or any awe surrounding art and those elements, to me, is an argument for a creator, because I don't think it can be explained in naturalistic perspective. And I haven't fleshed it out fully yet, but I think it's very hard to say, when we consider what happens in our minds when we engage with the objects or environments such as visual arts, music, poetry, experience of play, watching a fashion show, movies, sports, or exploring various aspects of nature, that there is a randomness to that. I think in my own experience, even my ability to appreciate art or aesthetics has grown over time. It isn't even a static or a fixed thing. I think it's expansive. And where I always ask, somebody who really wants to play the game of, well, there can't be a spiritual or creator, well, then where does non-utilitarian pleasure come from at all? It has to serve a purpose if you want it to be evolutionary in value at least. Reproduction serves a purpose. Eating serves a purpose. Shelter serves a purpose. What does a painting hanging on the wall serve? There's nothing but a pleasure derived from aesthetic. And I'll go through just very quickly two other kind of classical arguments. These have been around for a long time. I'll use Alvin Plantinga's version of the ontological argument. It's a little easier to understand, but it's the idea, is God a necessary being? And his is 6 steps. I have it in your notes, so you can go back and reflect on it, because it doesn't necessarily gel the first time, but it basically says, it is possible to have a maximally great being or a supreme being, that it's logically conceivable, basically. And that if it's possible for it to exist, it must exist somewhere, in some possible world. And if it can exist in some possible world, then it must exist in every possible world. Because if I can conceive it, and I go, okay, I can picture this great supreme being, it's logically valid to say it must exist then. Otherwise, I couldn't have even pictured it. If it was impossible, that's a whole different discussion. And that if it exists in the actual world, then it would say that is the thing that drives the world. And it then concludes, therefore, it must exist. And so it's this idea, if I can imagine it, it must exist somehow, some way. If it can exist anywhere, by definition, the greatest possible good or greatest, most supreme being would logically have to exist. I don't think this is the strongest argument, but it is the one that I think has been worked on most by rationalists to say, can I get to a reasonable belief of God independent of other facts and circumstances? Kind of, if I'm the brain in the vat theory, can I reasonably extrapolate God? The other one is the Cosmological Argument. In its most simplistic form in history, it had 3 points, and it's basically whatever begins to exist has a cause. This is the idea that if the universe started, there must have been something that caused it. We know that the universe began to exist, even though cosmologists may have added a lot of zeros to how long the world's been around. They do say it started existence at a point in time. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, this is again where Big Bang tries to come in and says, well, I can explain a materialistic view. What my old doctrine professor and now great apologist, Dr. William Lane Craig, added to this was 2 other points, and it was, if the universe has a cause, then an uncaused personal creator of the universe exists, who without the universe is beginningless, chainless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and enormously powerful. In other words, you have to have a cause outside of time and space that isn't being caused by something else. He would argue that based upon the creation that we see with order and design, it must have some personality or personal characteristics, and could have continued to exist for all of time without the universe, or outside of time, could have existed eternally. And then he concludes, therefore, this uncaused personal creator does exist because the universe exists. And the idea, in essence, is, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. If the reaction is the Big Bang and all of the cosmos coming into existence, you have to have a force pretty darn big to be the cause. You even had in Greek philosophy the unmoved mover. This has been a concept in various forms for a long time, even before modern science could have anywhere near begun to explain how big the universe is. And we're consistently finding, with the latest telescope out there, these new universes. I was just reading an article yesterday about a pulsar star that's not acting the way it should for its mass. They're consistently finding these things that don't fit pre-existing defined paradigms. the mysteries, if you will, of space and the significance of how big it is. And I think this argument, to me, is one of the better, just simplistic, rational arguments, because no credible scientist who I'm aware of says the universe that we now observe has been here forever. They'll acknowledge a starting point. Maybe it was lots of zeros of years back, but a starting point. And what's the most reasonable explanation for that starting point? And oh, by the way, virtually all cultures share some form of creation myth around a deity being involved in the creation of the universe. Now, modern critics would say that was just people filling the blanks. I would counter and say, but you don't have a plausible explanation given the numbers, and we looked at this last week, the Penrose number. Credible mathematicians have put the odds so extreme that a natural cause of any form is statistically improbable at the farthest end. Whereas if you grant me a creator that is omniscient and all-powerful, creation is not a problem for that being. Now, you may not like that conclusion, and therefore you're going to reject it. But my argument holds water. There was one small variant on this called the Leibniz argument from contingency. It's very similar to the ontological. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but basically, all of these arguments come down to it is consistent to argue there is an eternal, uncaused, metaphysical, necessary being involved in this. Now, how you want to characterize that, what attributes you give that creator, certainly may vary in different cultures. What is interesting to me is, I've met former Hindu and Muslim folks who came to faith because they started considering the way that their respective religions defined God was inadequate when compared to the universe. I think it's very interesting watching some of these who will attack Christianity very particularly, but haven't necessarily done the same for Judaism. Well, newsflash, the Jewish God is the same God as Christians, especially as it comes to the creation event. Our account is identical. The Torah, the first five, or Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible are identical to the first 5 books of our Old Testament. So it's curious to me. On the one hand, you'll attack Christianity, partly because it's culturally popular, but you'll not do any of the same things with Judaism. Well, then you haven't really dispelled the creator that I hold to be true at all. You've maybe mocked Christianity, congratulations, but you haven't disproven any of it. I do want to drill into some of the arguments against, because you're going to encounter these, and I want you to be prepared. I'm trying to give both sides a perspective so you're equipped and you won't be surprised. When I look at the cosmological argument, and some of these go back hundreds of years in some cases, I think one of the critiques that has some merit is that it's unwise to draw conclusions from an extrapolation of causality beyond experience. Now, is it in fact true that I can't experience enough of the universe to reasonably conclude that the cause has to be much, much bigger than any other thing I've ever encountered in my life? How much of creation do I really need to experience to go, that's pretty complex and pretty amazing? Even Carl Sagan, who was certainly not a Christian apologist, talked about space with just reverence and awe, a sense of billions of galaxies. A paradigm that said it's so big, it's unfathomable. Well, then the cause has to be at least one step bigger than whatever unfathomable is, whatever that thing is. The other one that sometimes they get into is this idea, well, what made God? And hence I think
you've seen the more modern ones really defining that God, creator that we would ascribe at least, is eternal and not created. He is the creator. There was no necessary cause for God. And I think probably the strongest of these is that just because it has to be first cause doesn't guarantee that first cause has to be God. And that's true. Doesn't guarantee it. And hopefully you've heard me say consistently through this, I don't know if I can prove beyond all reasonable or shadow of a doubt that God exists, but I can give reasoned belief for why God is consistent with what I observe in the universe, with what I've experienced personally, with what great minds have thought throughout time. It is not some fairy tale fictional account. It holds water and it holds up to scrutiny at weighty levels. And the question, what was there before the universe, makes no sense, and the concept of before becomes meaningless when considering a situation without time. And this argument in essence is, well, if time wasn't running, then what difference does it make? At one level, it doesn't make a difference for cosmology, but it makes a massive difference in the character of God. If God, in particular the triune God that we accept, the Trinity, exists in relationship within the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit for all of eternity, and God made a special creation act of the universe to bring humans, the cosmos, planet Earth into existence so that we could enjoy relationship with him. It ascribes to me this relational and loving and personal elements of God that transcends time and space. I'm not stuck having to say, well, it's, X million years or whatever metric somebody wants to use. It's relational. And I think we see this in Revelations at the end. New heaven and new earth comes along, and we will be in relationship with God for all of eternity thereafter. Don't know what time will look like. For the ontological, this is probably the one that's been around longer, and so there's more significant thought around it. David Hume said that any conception of God we may have, we conceive either of existing or not existing. And so he'd say that just because I can imagine something that's a supremely good, powerful being doesn't necessarily mean it exists. Immanuel Kant followed it up and said, some things are only necessarily true if they actually exist. Like a triangle only has to have three sides if it actually exists. My critique has always been, but show me any form of the natural world in which no triangle exists. It is a fundamental component of geometry, if you will. The shape of things have angles, and they're measurable. So to me, the fact that I can observe a universe that actually exists still means, therefore, the creator must actually exist. If this was sheerly some philosophical debate and we didn't have any universe to point to, sure, I suppose then it's theoretical. Unless you go all the way back to the mind in the vat theory, this is all a grand illusion, it doesn't actually exist. If it exists, really, then God must actually exist. This isn't some hypothetical. And finally, William Rowe just said, there's no way to know the existence of the greatest conceivable being without already knowing that he exists. And that it begs the question, well, in one sense that's true, but in the other, why is it I can conceive of God in the first place? I'm a finite being with limited resources. Why is it I even have a picture in my head of this all-powerful creator? Why is it that that's even a possibility if God had not granted that ability? I don't think most of the animal kingdom has self-awareness or consciousness that mirrors human reality. Based on all the biology I've seen, we can debate which animals are smarter than others, but they don't seem to have a moral compass. They certainly don't seem to have the aesthetic view, and I'm not entirely sure that what we're not seeing is more repetitive activity, motion, whatever, rather than a conscious thought. finally, I want to tackle the big elephant in the room. This is the one that probably comes up the most, the problem of evil and suffering. And Colin talked a little bit about this 2 weeks ago, but the basic critique goes something like this. If an omnipotent, benevolent, and omniscient God exists, then evil does not or should not. There is evil in the world, therefore there cannot be this all-powerful God. There's several core flaws to that. The biggest to me is you're presuming that there is no free will in that system, that it's all materialistically caused, that it's all reactionary or, responsive, that nothing is thought about. And I will start from a maxim that I started last week, and that is God desires as many people to freely choose to love him and be in relationship with him as possible. Is this, in fact, the world that maximizes that outcome? Is there a world that has no suffering and no pain to which the most people come to God? In my own life, apart from pain and suffering, I don't know that I would have found God. That's my own experience. And I have numerous people who have told me in their own lives that if it was not for some pain or suffering event they encountered, they would not have come to know God. Maybe we're all deluded, and there is some utopian world filled with rainbows and unicorns that leads everybody to God. But it doesn't seem to be consistent in my own life, where growth and the struggle against some obstacle allows me to develop self-esteem, knowledge, wisdom, what to do differently maybe the next time, and hope. I think overcoming adversity is part of hope. You see it happen. Otherwise, it would be fantasy. If no one ever was able to beat cancer, then the minute you got cancer, it's done. But we do know that based upon current science and circumstances, yes, some people do die of cancer. Categorically true. But lots of people, if it's detected early and depending on the form, it's highly treatable, and people do beat it. It's suffering, it's painful, it can involve surgeries and radiology and chemotherapy. I mean, lots of bad things may happen along that journey, but you come out the other side. And I have personally talked to some cancer survivors who said, if they had to do it over again, they wouldn't take an easier path. It fundamentally changed them as a person. It changed their perspective. I'm not sure everybody should go pray to that they get cancer for that experience, but it is representative, I think, this bigger question, is suffering maybe even a necessity, let alone just a outcome or byproduct? I also think we see a suffering God. We see Jesus choosing, not of his own causality or consequence, but to take on the suffering of the world on purpose, to die a bloody death so that all men could be restored completely to God with no other blood sacrifice necessary, no further action needed, that grace could then be redemptive. I think many philosophers have asked the question, can free will exist without at least the possibility of evil? I think if you can choose to do good, you, by necessity, have to have the choice to do evil. It would be hard-pressed to look through the last week's headlines in the news to conclude that people didn't make choices for evil. I don't know how a sane person could possibly get to the conclusion that nobody has chosen evil just in the last week. And it's also interesting to me, atheists are very quick to blame God for evil, but never want to give him any credit for good. Can we even have a balanced perspective? If we're going to say that somehow God is even causally related to evil, or at least however we define evil, wouldn't it be reasonable to say he's also causal for good? You can't have one side. I think this is also the critique of the church. Well, here's all the bad things the church did. Okay, fair. There are things that were bad. But what about the good? What about the fact about hospitals and trade and banks and modern medicine and most of the Renaissance art was all spurred out of the church as well. So you do have to at least take some balanced perspective. In my own view, I think God created the world to be perfect. Sin and evil entered in and corrupted the world. I think that's consistent with the Genesis account. I don't think even the youngest child, we miss the fact that they are self-oriented and are capable of doing good and bad. Mine being one of the early words, or no being usually like the second word. Defiance comes really early, and nobody sits them down and goes, okay, here's how you disobey mom and dad. Here's how you throw a tantrum. Nobody seems to have to explain that. It's just embedded as a reality. And I love Dietrich Bonhoeffer's statement as he's awaiting execution in a Nazi prison. He says, only the suffering God can help. And I think in this Ancient Wisdom series, we're hopefully painting this picture well, that we have a high priest who is acquainted and is familiar with our sufferings. It's not some removed God who has never experienced it. I think it's one of the uniqueness, looking across all the religions of the world. I don't see any other clear case of God sacrificing himself to restore humanity. Lots of times sacrificing others or demigods or humans for humanity, but I don't see any other painting or portrait or picture of God sacrificing himself and taking on that burden. And I think that is a uniqueness in Christianity that is distinct. It shouldn't be lost in this a la carte soup of spirituality. The crystals, the essential oils aren't making any sacrifice. They're innate objects. But we believe that there was Jesus Christ, God incarnate, said, I'm all in. I'm here to wipe the slate clean, to settle the debt. That is such a powerful thing if we understand grace fully, that it is awe-inspiring, that this omniscient, all-powerful deity, creator says, I'm taking the lowly form of a human, I'm modeling this walk of life, fairly short period of public ministry, a couple of years, and then I will prove it in the resurrection. And maybe one way to think about this. Any of you ever played with the New York Times crossword puzzles? Did you know that every one of you can solve that puzzle perfectly, very easily? Just wait till tomorrow. And you'll have all the answers for today's crossword. Of course, that's not the point of the crossword puzzle. It's not to fill in the blanks. And I don't think life's purpose is to fill in the blanks. I think life's purpose sometimes is to wrestle through and to struggle and to try in our humanness to find the answers. And sometimes God gives us an answer key, or at least one of the answers. But I don't think anything that has value in my life has ever come at no cost. Ralph Waldo Emerson is at least an agnostic, said 160 years ago, whatever now. You never truly own anything in life unless you've paid for it line for line and deed for deed. That unless you've paid the price for it, you don't appreciate it, you don't understand it, it's not fully yours. But when you have paid the price of hardship, suffering, those are lessons you own. Those are lessons that you now can in turn share with somebody else. You can be somebody else's inspiration, somebody else's hero. I think apart from some level, and I'm fully prepared to acknowledge if I was God, I want to ratchet the dial down a little, but I'm not. I don't understand his ways. But I know there has to be some level of necessary friction for life to be A, worth living, and for B, to have any sense of accomplishment. We even see it in the Israelites wandering through the deserts. Manna, food literally falls from the sky, but rots every day. That somehow that became a stumbling block, the ease of which that seemed to happen, and ultimately led to a false idol at the end of that. I'm still a little puzzled by it personally. And so I think there has to be something that isn't perfect. I mean, it's really interesting. Even the movie series The Matrix, which I think they pulled some parallels, certainly from Christianity into. It was a very secular movie. But they even, as secular authors, concluded that the problem was if the world was too perfect, people would reject it. That there had to be some level of friction just for it to even be believable, if you will. And I don't trivialize this and the type of suffering people have encountered. You know, I've sat and I've prayed and I've cried with people who've lost loved ones in tragic circumstances. I mean, I don't want to sugarcoat it by any stretch of the imagination. But I do not believe that evil and or suffering is inconsistent with a loving God. I think we have a belief biblically of God works all things together for the good of those that serve him. Not that all things are good. Some things are categorically bad. I fully accept and embrace that. But I would not be the person I am today apart from the suffering. And if I was honest, you know, it gets really hard to go back and say, which things would I skip? Which hard things would I skip? Because it would mean I'm incomplete. I wouldn't have the knowledge and the experience I have today without it. And I've said before, I wish I was smart enough to learn from other people's mistakes. But unfortunately, I still have to touch the hot stove just to find out for myself. And by the grace of God, those moments, and at least 3 or 4 of them that could have reasonably and statistically likely should have led to my death, didn't. I'm living on borrowed time, I get it, but it's also allowed me a perspective that is very freeing because now every moment is a blessing. Every moment is extra. I don't think I would understand how to love people in the way I do today apart from suffering in my own life. I think my own ego and arrogance would be a barrier in my ability to humbly and unconditionally love anybody else. That was broken in me by life circumstances. And I have talked to numerous other folks who have some similar view. Not everybody gets there, but I think it happens a lot. And I want to conclude with this thought. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let the steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. That's James. And I pulled this picture. Believe it or not, people actually intentionally put themselves through suffering. There are these obstacle courses with mud and hurdles and all these things that people pay good money to go compete in. I think it's further evidence that at an intrinsic level, humans understand the need for adversity. That things of value come in the trials and the purification process, if you will. You know, if we think about gold or silver and you heat it up and you skim the dross off and you do it a couple of times till the impurities are substantively gone. And I love the imagery I've heard of this illustration that the older versions of this using, you know, whatever primitive tools, the purification was clear when you could see your own reflection. And I think we likewise are purified when people can see Christ's reflection in us. You know, when there's enough of the human brokenness skimmed away, beaten out of, heated out of, whatever process it goes through, that we come out the other side radically different than we started. You know, I don't pray for suffering. Some are willing to do that. I applaud their courage. But I also know that for me to become the person God intends me to be, there's a lot of my old self that has to die, that has to go away. And however much of that I can rid in a reasonable time frame, the better chances I am to be able to engage in a community of people, family, friends, the church at large, and have impact. to the degree the old self, the selfish stuff, the broken stuff stays, it hinders my ability to have a voice and an influence. And so I don't flinch from suffering anymore. I don't certainly go seeking it out. And that's a hard perspective for someone apart from Christ who doesn't think there is any purpose other than, kind of eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow you may die. Suffering makes a lot less sense if it's all random and none of it was on purpose and none of it was guided for an outcome. But I think suffering has a very different perspective when put in the framework of, I start here, God wants to get me here. And along that transition, sure, some good things will happen, that's great. But unfortunately, some bad things are going to have to happen. So I come to the end of myself and I go, okay, fine, God. What is it you want from me today? What are you trying to teach me? What are you trying to remove from my pattern, maybe by brute force? And then suffering isn't meaningless anymore. So we'll switch to discussion for a few minutes. Pick any one of these questions, but which argument kind of you think about when you're talking about the existence of God with somebody, which kind of your go-to? How would you describe your personal step of faith in the process towards experiencing God? What did that look like for you? Is there a specific logical fallacy you see often in your experience, your daily outcome? I think there's several we highlighted. And what is one problem you see with random evolution and natural selection? If it's just purely mechanical, statistical, what do you see as the problem? Absent a creator or a guide. So we'll take a little bit of time for discussion. Oh, Bob, you had a question?
Yeah, well, actually not a question, more of a statement. I think this whole today kind of clarified for me a question that has been long-standing with me was, why did Solomon turn bad?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because he was given, at the beginning, he was given wisdom with no suffering
Yeah.
whatsoever. And I gained wisdom
Mm-hmm.
through my suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he needed to validate his wisdom by doing the things that would make him suffer.
Yeah.
So it kind of clarified that for me, crystallized it. Because I always wondered, why did he turn bad after he knew all this stuff? Because he had to test it.
Yeah, and the words of the great American philosopher Forrest Gump, stupid is, stupid does. Well, and he, he did pray for a wise heart. I mean, I think he understood wisdom at a heart level, but I think he was flawed like all the rest of us. And there were some things that he violated that were God's tenets. And I think that's the other piece. A lot of times we don't like talking about. It's uncomfortable. But some of suffering is just natural consequence to our own decisions. Unfortunately, I've come alongside and co-labored beside people with addictions. They do suffer from sometimes the consequence of those decisions in the addictive pattern. That's unfortunate. It's something I wish I could help them avoid, but most have to fall a few times before they go, you know what? I don't want to do that anymore. I'm done with that. It's too painful. So, yeah, I think Solomon to some degree had to learn, and I also think there's just, in the humanness, having obtained power and prestige and wisdom, things that would have mattered in that time, he wanted more. I think that was the original temptation. You can be like God. You can have more. Never mind this perfect garden, there's something more for you. The knowledge of good and evil was fundamentally at stake. And it turns out knowing evil wasn't maybe all it was chalked up to be. So take a few minutes for discussion, and then we'll wrap up.